Hi everyone, my name's Kirsty Anderson and I'm the Principal Manager of Public Engagement for the Global CCS Institute, and I'm very pleased to be your host for today's webinar. So welcome to all the people tuned in around the globe who are in different time zones, and particular thanks to those die-hard social research enthusiasts that are tuning in the middle of the night from the Americas region. You're all muted throughout the webinar, so don't worry, your snoring will not disturb us. And that's because there will be no snoring, because today we are joined by social research royalty. Peta and Anne-Maree, your wardrobe might not be getting as much attention as Princess Kate, but the body of social research into CCS that you've produced or coordinated has been read the world over. So I'm really delighted that you've been able to join us today to discuss the body of work, and in particular the findings and the recommendations of the synthesis of your work and the work of other CCS researchers that you completed for us last year. Ladies and gentlemen, I know that what Peta and Anne-Maree will be going through today will be of great interest to you and perhaps to some of your colleagues as well. So the good news is that today's session is being recorded and it will be made available on our website not too long after this live broadcast. So please feel free to listen again or to pass it to your friends or colleagues. Now, before I explain a few of the logistics, just to help you get the most out of the webinar, let me first properly introduce Anne-Maree and Peta. So, despite her very youthful looks, Peta has assured us that she has over 25 years of experience in management and leadership roles. And sadly, Peta has recently moved on from her role as a lead social science researcher for CSIRO's energy flagship. In addition to her management experience, Peta has a broad expertise and research interest in community outreach and engagement, exploring public reactions to the range of energy mitigation technologies, investigating the nexus between climate mitigation and adaptation opportunities, sustainability and sustainable development, technology assessment, and also energy efficiency. And Dr. Anne-Maree Dowd is a group leader and a senior social scientist at CSIRO, which doesn't mean that she's one of the few scientists that will give you a wave and a welcoming chat as you pass her office. As a social scientist, Anne-Maree has 12 years of experience working in project and capability management, in social network analysis, in community engagement, public awareness and acceptance of energy technologies, behaviour change, and transformational adaptation decision making in Australian primary industries. So you can see that you're in very good hands for the next hour. So today we're going to really hope that we're taking full advantage of having Anne-Maree and Peta to answer all of our questions. And I might pose a few questions during the presentation, but I'd just like to encourage all of you that are listening that if you do have questions that you'd like to ask Peta or Anne-Maree, then please, as they're going through their presentation, you just submit any questions that you have using this questions tab that's on the GoToWebinar control panel, which is on your screen. The questions that you type into that control panel are sent directly to me, and I'll save them up and group them as best I can so that at the end of Peta and Anne-Maree's presentation we can have a really interactive discussion, and I'll do my best to answer or ask as many of the questions as you submit. If we run out of time or if there's questions that we can't answer, then we'll do our best to get an answer for you sent to you after the webinar. So, without any further ado, let me hand over to today's two expert presenters, Anne-Maree and Peta.
Thank you very much, Kirsty. It's Anne-Maree Dowd here and Peta Ashworth. And thanks to everybody who's joined. We should say good morning, good afternoon, good evening, I suppose. It really is a global webinar. And we're really happy to share the research, I think, with a range of you, really looking at this synthesis. And I guess first just to acknowledge the funding that came from the Institute way back in 2009. I think their sort of insights into recognising the importance of public awareness, perception, communication, research was really integral to the work that we did. And so first of all, we just flashed up a copy of the report page and where it is available. I'm not sure how many of you have actually gone there and accessed the report. It's been there for a little while. But hopefully we've really tried to arrange that report to make it very easy and accessible for people to read. And I would like to acknowledge the authors there. So in addition to Anne-Maree and myself, Shelley Rodriguez and Talia Generat here at CSIRO did a lot of the groundwork, and also Leslie and Reese Howell and Simon Shackley in University of Edinburgh. They did a literature review of more of the more recent literature, and that was included in the report too. So I just wanted to make sure that we recognise all of their input. But on top of that, none of this work that came out of the funding would have been possible without the research partners around the world. And so I've just listed there, I won't go through them all, but you can see there's a range of people and institutions that contributed to this work. And right back when we were first scoping it up, several of those social scientists sat down together and we really looked at what are the gaps, because we have tried not to reinvent the wheel with any of this, but where can we build on synergies to find sort of new information to share with projects around the world. And then just to make it easy, this is a graphical representation where you can see where a lot of the research has taken place. And I guess one of the things that we've noticed is that it's probably only in more recent times that there's a bit more focus on developing countries. So the results that we're featured here are very much in the developed world. And I guess in some ways it was where the concentrations of researchers that sort of first started out with carbon capture and storage research were located. And this is just to explain in more detail. It is actually in the report, and you can go to it to have a look. But basically what we tried to look there is what were the types of research that's been undertaken. So you've got a little legend there around qualitative and quantitative research. So was it a survey method? Was it a focus group, a large group process? And the little yellow dots feature specifically research that was part of the funding from the Global Institute. And then there are a few other ones which I'll talk about in the methodology that we included because they were seen to be important and often cited. So that just gives you a bit of an idea of the geographic spread of where the research that we concentrated on and that's featured in the report. So what did we do? Basically, over that period of 4 years, researchers produced 25 different reports, and there was a whole lot of things that went into that. And so what we did was actually look at all of the references that were in those reports, and that was the work that Shelley and Talia spent a lot of time doing. And actually, when we compiled those, there was over 900 of them. And so then they started to look through and think, well, which are the articles that are often cited? So any articles that were cited 3 or more times, we tried to hone in on those. And in actual fact, of those 900, there was 14. So what we did is actually pulled those 14 articles alongside the 25 reports and did a qualitative analysis looking at the key themes that emerged. And from that, we actually honed it down to 7 major themes. Now, I'm going to go through those in a minute, but basically, the way we've then structured the report is actually around these 7 key themes. So when you go to the report, I'll just spend a minute just to explain how we've structured each of them, and I'll go into more detail to explain each of them. In the report, we've actually we talk about the key findings, and that's really highlighted in a blue box. We then include some of the supporting literature that explains how we came to settle on this as a key theme, and a lot of that work is also the work of Leslie and Reese and Simon. Then we hone in on some recommendations, which Anne-Maree is going to talk more about. There's a list of probably 3 or 4 or 5 key reading that we thought was important. And in that list, you'll see a couple of them will be highlighted as blue. And so what we've done then is actually summarise what was that really about in the appendix, in Appendix C. So if you haven't been to the report, I just thought I'd encourage you to go and have a look, and that's the structure. So when you look at these themes, you're probably going, oh, well, that's not really telling us much. But I think from our point of view as social scientists, I guess these are the things that we have seen have been critical when you're thinking about how do you engage, how do you move forward a carbon capture and storage project. And some of you that have worked in the communications and engagement space, or some of you who are technical people, have probably come up with some of these as well. So framing of CCS. I think from the earliest research, I can remember that I did way back in 2003, 2004, and other work that Simon Shackley did in the UK, is that what we found is if you're going to talk about CCS, you can't just advocate for it as a standalone technology. It's very unlikely to be tolerated in that way. And so I think the idea is how you frame it is very important, and being cognizant of what is the stakeholder group that you're talking to will really impact on the message and how it's received. The second thing when we're getting into actual projects is the importance of local context. So the idea of actually really understanding what's going on in the community, where you're engaging, where you're wanting to deploy a project, where you're even considering a project, is really important, because what we've found, people like Judith Bradbury, the work that we've done here, in FutureGen, different places, is that what's gone on before, the history that's gone on, really impacts how open the community will be to your project. So for example, if there is a legacy of poor mining rehabilitation that's happened, or there's been some sort of incident where government's intervened, that tends to leave history with that community, and often it can be much harder to overcome or to bring in a new project if there's been some sort of issue that's held over for some time. So actually really taking the time to understand what's important to that local community, what are the issues, what might be some opportunities, really helps, I think, when you're actually starting to go out and talk about a project, even from the start of talking to a local council member or a regional shire and those sorts of things. Now, trust, there's been a lot of work by our colleagues at the University of Leiden, Bart Turwell, Emma Morse, which I think really is world leading on the issue of trust, not only for CCS, but it can be applied in so many different contexts. But I guess what we're looking at that is different levels of trust. So building trusting relationships, how do you do that? You've got to be consistent, you've got to be honest and transparent, actually allow people to interact, to ask questions. So there's quite a lot of detail in the report about how we build trust, and Anne-Maree will talk a little bit more about some of those recommendations. So not surprising, communication engagement processes are important, and I guess here what we're talking about is how to engage rather than the what. So really thinking about how do you set up ways to engage interactively, the different sort of levels, high-level engagement, down at the project level, those sorts of things. What are the different processes you might consider to use to communicate around the project? Obviously, information. What we're talking about here is access to quality information, stuff that's factual and relevant. Also, that whole idea about where CCS fits in the wider energy context. And I think, a bit like Kirsty said, we have to be open to answer questions. I think with information, for the most part, you can probably pick the top questions that are going to come up, but as a community becomes more familiar with a project, the types of information they might be seeking will change, and I think it's actually being available and being able to respond to that and find that credible information is important. Risk perception, is it safe? How risky is it? I mean, risk perception and risk communication, I think, has been an underpinning theme for carbon capture and storage research in the social sciences from the beginning. And in actual fact, it really is where I started out in my research, is sort of understanding how people perceive risk and what are the factors that will influence how stakeholders might change. And then governance. What we're thinking about here, what came up, is the idea of obviously regulatory guidelines can help to overcome those risk perceptions of safety, but also things around governing fairness and procedural justice comes into that. What we then did, looking at those themes, is think, well, how does that fit together? And so basically working as a team of researchers and looking at that, and actually working backwards and forwards with Kirsty and Klaus van Alphen, I think, as well, was really looking at, well, what does this mean and how does it work? So you can see here in this model that we've pulled together, we've called it a framework of interactions. And you can see lots of double-headed arrows. And I think that we have to be very clear as communicators and project proponents or researchers that are trying to understand how people perceive this, is that really is a two-way street. And that what you do in one area will really impact on the other part. But we put trust in the middle because I think we see that as being central to actually helping to build a positive disposition. And so the other thing that sits outside that box of interactions is the external influences that are going on. So what we mean there is thinking about, well, what else is happening, in the broader context? What's the economics of the country or that community? What sort of social cultural things do we need to take into consideration? There's a whole, even the political things that are playing out as we've seen what's happened in Australia. Across the board, these external influences will actually impact on how a CCS project is perceived. So what we were looking at is, well, how do we bring these together to try and create a positive disposition towards CCS, which we've framed that level of acceptance there. So that's just to give you a little bit of an introduction. I think I'm going to hand over to Anne-Maree now, who's going to talk through some of the things and our recommendations that came from that.
Thanks, Peter. So to build on the findings that we found around the different types of theories, the different types of applied research, and the types of findings that they eventually have published in their either reports or journal articles, we also wanted to pull out from a practical perspective for the report to have that association between that theory into what CCS projects on the ground could actually draw upon from an actual hands-on perspective. And it's been very much what we've tried to aim to do with all the reports that we've had, is to also have that connection to how can a CCS project actually relate this information on the ground. So out of the 7 themes, we provided several different recommendations. So starting off with the first one on how do you frame CCS. And as Peter said, we highly recommend that CCS isn't just approached and talked about and engaged with the community as a standalone technology. People need to be able to contextualise where does this technology fit in the greater scheme of things in regards to climate change, energy production, and their community as well, and from a development perspective. So considering from a perspective to engage a community, it is exceptionally helpful if you contextualise where does CCS fit in a broader picture. And going and having those discussions with the community, you need to be able to provide that rationality as to where it fits, as well as then from a policy perspective, how CCS underpins, how from a national and international policy perspective, CCS will assist in achieving those policy areas. The next recommendation feeds into that particular area around a local context. So really getting to understand the key components and characteristics of a community, the social, cultural, economic and political areas that each of those communities actually sit within. And once again, one of the reports that was developed was the social site characterisation tool available on the GCCSI website that helps programs take the theory on how to actually go about understanding that local context and providing a tool in order to help collect that information that's actually needed. Because without that baseline of knowledge and awareness from a project perspective, it makes it more difficult to understand where the communities are coming from, what information needs that they have, and how do you avoid them misunderstanding where you're coming from and also having those false expectations. It also helps with you to preempt any issues that may come up with that community based on you actually knowing where that community is coming from and their past history with other development projects, as well as then where they're coming from and where they want to go in the future. The next theme, which is really the key theme from the model and a lot of research is based around trust. So it's having a clear understanding that you need to not only as a project in yourself be able to engage and communicate and interact with the community, because from a trust perspective, as a standalone organisation and project, you're not seen as trustworthy. So the recommendation is for you to identify yourself with other trusted organisations and individuals within that community and who that community looks for as trusted advisors, as stakeholders that they really rely on trusted information, and aligning yourself to those stakeholders and getting them on board in order to have a collaborative approach to that communication and providing information to those stakeholders so they are trusted, they're reliable, and they also have the information to answer questions when they're approached by particular constituents. So you're trying to have a pathway of where people are open to information, they're open to providing feedback, they're opening up that two-way communication by taking advantage of building the best trust relationship that you can. The next recommendation, as Peter said, is around the communication and engagement components. So this particular part of the actual report in itself was having a look at the ways in which you can engage and communicate with the community as opposed to the communication methods itself. So here we're having a look at what are the possible gaps in knowledge and understanding that the community has a lack of, and how can you fill that particular void, and what are the particular processes in which you can do that. What we've found is the most successful way is actually being open to having processes that really embrace having meaningful dialogue. And that may be a face-to-face interaction, it can be one-on-one, it can be from a group perspective, and the report reflects on several different processes that we've found quite successful. But each of them have taken into consideration of having two-way communication opportunities within that process, that you're actually using trusted advocates in that process, and that people have the ability to be open and transparent in order to build those relationships over time, as well as being provided information that they can trust. So what you're looking at is also drawing upon not only within your own projects of having your experienced communication team involved, but also drawing upon the expertise of those from other trusted organisations in order to provide the highest level of communication and engagement that's possible from the whole CCS project in itself. The next one then is actually having a look at the information. So this is actually what you provide to the community, and it's definitely having a look at, you need to provide a wide variety of information. So through informal, formal, technical through to the simple types of channels, as well as the way in which that information is provided. So that needs to have an understanding of the type of stakeholder that you're engaging and the way in which that stakeholder would like to receive and interact with information about CCS. So tailoring your information to your different audiences is crucial, and who actually delivers that information and where it's sourced from is also critical in this component and theme. The next area is around risk perception and risk communication. So how do you deal with issues related to perceptions of risk around CCS, and the way in which then you communicate and deal with those risk perceptions. So the best way that we found from the research was once again drawing upon that two-way communication process, where they have an open dialogue between the project and trusted sources in order to get responses and tailored responses to their specific questions and fears about the CCS technology. Your project needs to be flexible in the way that it allows the public to influence the outcome. So if there's the possibility to alleviate risks based on where a particular pipeline is going to go, or where the well is actually situated, if there's not an opportunity for maybe the community to be involved in that type of process, the level of risk perception rises. So the more they can actually get involved in that process, the much better you'll have of it addressing the risk perceptions that they actually have. The last one then was the governance theme. So this is definitely then looking at how do you integrate and get your project in line with the different policies, regulations that are required from a legal perspective, but also too, how do you integrate yourself into the governance within the community as well. So you do have legal and regulatory frameworks from a technical perspective for CCS that you have to align yourself with, which is very much at that local, state and national level. But you also then have to look at how do you also, as a project funder, try to align yourself between yourself and different other projects that are in that region, as well as then the direction in which that local community and area wants to move ahead with. So it's the opportunity for communities to also be involved in that decision-making process. And we have recommendations in the report that looks at ways in which you can tailor different liaison contacts, different committees that you can form in order for people to be involved in that decision-making process from the ground level up. So once again, just showing how it all fits together. Once again, the central key theme tends to be trust, and we've also found that in more recent papers around our colleagues that are doing research from a mining perspective around a social license to operate. Trust is also seen as is very fundamental in achieving then acceptance and a social license to work in that area. So trust is really the key theme, and then the other themes then feed into each other and overlap. And so it's having an understanding that if you really don't have all those themes and ducks lined up, then you may have issues then of it just really not working together as a strong project if you don't have those all linked up. So I'll hand over to Peter to summarise for you.
So I guess thanks everybody for listening, and you might be sitting there and thinking, actually this isn't a bit underwhelming, and I think that quite often we as social scientists, I know some of the communications experts, people like Kirsty as well, that we're often surprised sometimes, not even with carbon capture and storage projects, but other projects where things often go wrong. And I think really, I use this a lot, it's actually not rocket science. I mean, a fundamental to any project engagement, whether it is CCS or other energy technologies or anything that's new in a community, is this whole idea of a need for mutual respect. And I often talk about it as, when I think I use the example in Korea around building a house, so we all have concerns, we all start looking around when something new is happening. So it's really important, I think, that any company or project proponent or researchers go in, there's a need for mutual respect. I think one of the key things that we learn where projects are actually more successful at moving forward is this idea of flexibility and having time. So often there's a commercial dollar value to that, so going a bit slow costs more. But in actual fact, when you look at what would be the cost of a failed project, like it actually being shut down because it did have community opposition and people weren't confident, I actually think this is where you've got to see it as an investment. So actually being able to actually step back sometimes and go a little bit slower to answer more questions, to do some different engagements, some more face-to-face meetings in the local area, whatever it might be, I think that's critical. The idea of the legacy issues, you have to be able to know what's happened in the past, you have to acknowledge those. And I think really, in some ways, be able to identify why is your project different, because quite often, and I think David Reiner and there's a lovely article, a reference that he made around the people that often industry and energy, electricity providers are ones that are least trusted. So here we are, there's industry coming in quite often to actually do a project, and so you're almost in some ways coming from the back foot. So it doesn't have to be a negative as long as you're acting with integrity and acknowledging and differentiating, I think, why you are different. And I think the other thing that, as there was a big sort of very hopeful sort of deployment plan, roadmap for CCS, and we know that that's slowed down and, it's waxed and waned, and it's still going to be integral. But I think what that is also doing is these demonstration projects and projects that are actually already on the ground and operating, as these build up, they're going to become really useful reference material to point to, which helps to build confidence. So I know when we used to engage way back, 405 and talking about pipelines of carbon dioxide, the fact that you could point to a pipeline that already existed for many years and has been transporting CO2, people go, okay, I feel confident in that. So I think that that's actually going to be a real positive going forward, getting it right in these research projects, the early test cases, I suppose. And I think that's all we've got. So thank you, everybody, for listening. And we might hand back to wonderful Kirsty.
Thanks, guys. I think to finish up, I wanted to thank you both for a really fascinating presentation, but also I think it's probably important to highlight to people that the what you've really managed to achieve with this body of social research, and it's, for me, the important thing is that you've managed to really make it accessible to social to projects that are working. So it's taking something which is fairly academic and making it as accessible as possible and as applied as possible to project development. And I think it's a real strength of the material that has come out of this body of work and from the funding that the Institute put in. So kudos to you for that. And I just wanted to, before we move on to the discussion, highlight to people, the questions are kind of coming through thick and fast now, but we will do our best to ask as many as possible. If you are just, Kylie, if you could circle your mouse and just show them again where you put your questions in on the webinar tab. So you can see Kylie's just highlighting it for you there. So if Peta and Anne-Maree, if you guys are okay, you've managed to get a sip of water in, then I'll move straight into the discussion section of the webinar.
Yep.
So, cool. So one of the first questions that popped through was actually to do with governance, the theme of governance, but it's really asking what you would say the level of understanding of legal and regulatory frameworks is amongst project developers. And do you think, and this is European specific, so I might jump in at some point, but is the current framework in Europe helping to facilitate or prevent CCS to develop?
I might start. I think, the level, and Kirsty, you might have some more on the ground from your experience over there. I mean, from a more broad perspective, dealing with the project or my interaction with project proponents that I have met over the years, I think there's a really good understanding of the importance of having those frameworks. I think for some it has actually been a slow process, and I guess it's that whole idea of, I can remember in the early days here in Australia, that idea of how much do you need to regulate when it's starting out to give some flexibility. I know the Victorian government was very keen when they were developing theirs to actually allow a little bit of flexibility. So I think project proponents are very aware of the need for them. As to whether they're actually, and I think it depends on each country as to how it fits and whether that's being helpful or whether some projects are finding it more difficult.
I think from my perspective, due to probably the delay in getting that regulatory frameworks up and running in all the countries that have demonstration sites, it can be slightly detrimental to a particular project, because from a community perspective, if those regulations and frameworks were actually in place, it provides them with some sort of procedural justice perspective, that they just think, well, at least, we can have our say and we can have our interactions with the project, but we also know that someone else is also watching what they're doing. They have to report that they're being safe. And sometimes without that framework being in place, it can just feed more into that risk perception that communities can have, and also the building of trust.
Yeah, and I think possibly, Anne-Maree, as well, in Europe it's about, obviously there's European legislation and there is national legislation in each of the member states, and it can be quite different depending on which country you're in. I think the question that Marco had asked was around project developers and their understanding of the legal and regulatory frameworks, and trying to make use of those legal and regulatory frameworks for exactly the point that you're making, to try and instill that trust and that level of comfort with stakeholders that that there is these kind of procedures in place, that they're not going to waver from them, and that they are going around their project in a sensible and responsible way. Okay, so we've got a bit of a philosophical question about perceptions. So this is from Derek Taylor, and he's asked, what is the difference between a person's belief in climate change and their perception of climate change, and how do we change their perception as opposed to their belief? That's a very social research question.
I have to think about it. It's interesting. There's actually a wonderful paper that was written, and in fact, I could probably dig it out and send it to you, Derek, later. It was some work done by some researchers at the University of Queensland around climate deniers. And it's actually quite a lovely piece because it sort of came about from, they put out some information around, they did some research around how do you frame climate change, or you know, what happens, is there another way that we can frame the messages around climate change to actually move people in a different way. And so what they did was actually put out messages around, instead of actually referring to climate change, they were talking around what might 2050 in Australia look like if it was more sustainable, and actually were engaging with a lot of people that were deniers. And in actual fact, a lot of the things that they settled on were very similar to what I suppose people that are strong believers in climate change were working towards. But what, again, it was just a different framing. And it was quite interesting because this person was actually, who was giving the presentation on the paper and the work, talked about the fact that they got a whole lot of really anti-messages targeting them after the paper was published. And he felt quite happy because he was actually up in Scotland at the time visiting relatives. And so the poor researcher back in Australia was having to deal with it. But of course he was watching from afar. But then he was staying with his lovely old uncle and auntie, and he showed a picture of them, and then he realised that actually his uncle must have been reading the blogs that were going, because he was saying exactly the same thing. And so he realised actually, so even within family there's a difference, but it doesn't make them, you know, any better or worse. But actually being able to think around different ways of framing that message, or what does that alternative sustainable future look like, can actually be a way of taking out that issue around belief and perception and moving it forward. I probably didn't describe that very well because I'm sort of responding very quickly, but Derek, I'd happily pull that out because I think it really is an interesting thing around actually we can come to some agreements about what a sustainable future might look like, even if people don't necessarily believe in the climate change, which can actually cause some issues. Anne-Maree, do you want to say any more on that?
Yeah, because I think too, even in the beginning when we're saying you can't, it's not beneficial to just talk about CCS as a technology on its own. And in the beginning it was like going, but if you frame it in the context of, you know, well, we're using CCS as a suite of options to deal with climate change, you know, does that particularly resonate with that particular community? And to me, unless you actually go and do like your site characterizations and those sorts of things and get an understanding about, well, what's important to that community, is a climate change belief strong, weak, and figure that out. But most of the time, even if you take climate change and frame climate change into that, as Peter was saying, into that more overall sustainability framework, then most people don't have a problem in engaging on the topic of sustainability, of which energy, climate, land use, all those types of areas play all different weighted roles for that particular community, and it just helps take it to another level of where you have more common agreement.
I don't know, just to carry on, Kirsty, and I'll stop in a minute, but this whole issue of fossil fuels that, you know, we know they're going to be around for some time to come. So, and with that, obviously things around reliability, security of supply, and even affordability. Now CCS adds another level of expense, but over the course of longer term, I mean, in some ways, you know, CCS in its own right allows greater access in the longer term if we are continuing in a fossil fuel world as we transition to a more sustainable future. So I think that starts to come into play sometime.
Yeah. Guys, I've got a question which kind of comes back to the point you were making about the social research being predominantly in some of the more developed countries. So this is a question asking about local context and trust, and they're specifically asked what were the findings in dealing with language barriers, and they've gone on to further explain that they're trying to explain not only the CCS concept but its place within the energy security, climate change mitigation context to a non-educated community member. And it kind of comes to a couple of questions that we've had from people around about how big a challenge do you see this lack of understanding, but this one was specifically around language barriers and a lack of understanding in developing countries.
I think that's the important part, Kirsty, of actually having local people. So I remember back to our social research meeting in Calgary in January when Polly Modiko presented from the South African context. And it really struck me watching the presentation then, you know, the challenges for Polly are quite different from, you know, us going to engage, say, in the Southwest Hub or where Carbon Net is happening in Australia or Future Gen or so forth, because people have really different needs. If people actually don't have access to electricity, you know, doing an R&D project on and spending, governments investing lots of money, I think that's going to be a really tough sell. From the point of view of people understanding, I think, again, it gets back to local people, like using your local communicators. I mean, they can, even those who aren't very educated can actually, if we're starting talking about needs and things, you can frame it, you can put things into simple messaging. But again, it's about really understanding who's the audience, what's the way to engage with them, what is the way to sit down and talk about it, but also what are their needs. So I think asking someone to consider a CCS project when they actually don't have access to, you know, turning on the power as we so, you know, easily do here in Australia, you know, we've got to look at, first of all, how do you address that need, perhaps then alongside it, and then people will start to consider it. I remember early on when we talked about CCS did sort of that whole energy security. Well, in a developed country, actually, if you've got that energy loss through actually, you know, through trial with CCS, that might actually stop people getting access to electricity. So I think it's again, just making sure it's contextualised and that you really do attend to the different audience levels and what they might be looking for.
Yeah, and it's definitely a key area that we've highlighted in a couple of papers as well as the report, that the research that we did was definitely then biased to a Western culture, and that we've identified that truly really understanding how you engage around CCS in developing countries is a very big gap in the literature.
Yeah. I think as a sort of general point, the emphasis that's been put on trust throughout even the sort of developing country literature is definitely applicable, and it's that, you know, whenever we look at a lack of understanding or a lack of education around not just CCS but wider energy context or the climate change context, that trust becomes all the more important. So having, you know, the reassurance that the people who are looking after these projects or the governments that are funding these projects have the best intentions in mind is then becomes all the more critical, I would say. Okay, we've got a bit of a one that's going to mix the pot, perhaps. I've got a question asking, you know, why do we feel the need to explain all of this to the public when projects such as more dangerous hydrocarbon gas storage projects don't seem to go through the same process and beat themselves with the rod that we appear to be beating ourselves with?
Well, I would say because people are demanding it. I just, you know, I think we've seen from projects where things have gone awry that people, because it's in their mind, for if you look at the whole suite or the whole beginning to end of a carbon capture and storage project, for people in a local context are unfamiliar, they're concerned. They have perceived risks about it. So, you know, they need to know. Now, it depends at what part what you focus on in those conversations. And what we've found as you start to engage, and I'm sure there's people on the line that would have just as much, if not more, experience with this, is that as a project plays out within the community, those questions and concerns will change. So at the start, you might see that more and more people are coming to information sessions, or they might be coming past to the drop-in centre, or however you've chosen to communicate. But after a while, then it's almost that starts to wane, I suppose, because they become more comfortable with the project. And I think the Otways found that as well. And so I think over time, and that was, I think, my point at the end, is that these demonstrations and things will start to make people more comfortable. But at the moment, they are concerned. You know, what happens when you push liquid CO2 or supercritical CO2 down near my water if I'm a farmer or so forth? You can't expect people not to raise concerns. And so I think to not bother or not to put that time, then you risk that whole commercial risk of the project.
And
I was
thinking too, Kirsty, that, you know, at a lot of the discussions that we have around CCS, a lot of them find themselves quite lucky that they're not coal seam gas.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, you can't base the way in which you engage, communicate, set up regulations on luck. So the work needs to go into being honest, building the trust. Otherwise, you will end up to be coal seam gas who haven't done this process properly, tried to educate people, and just being honest about, you know, that will have ripple effects, because people have done exactly the same thing when it comes to understanding what fracking is, and have then associated fracking then to geothermal technology, which is a completely different way of doing fracking, but they hear the word fracking and then associate it. So to me, CCS is actually just on pure luck, have gotten away with not being shown up in the media and things like that. But if projects are really taking this seriously and doing the hard yards and out there and communicating and letting people know the technical side and putting it in an information and engaged way, they won't associate what CCS can do for their community and for a greater picture than other technologies that haven't done that ground setting
work. Yeah, I think I had a recent conference, a geoscience conference, and it was fascinating because it was speaking to people from the nuclear storage industry and the fracking community, and the message that was coming through loud and clear was that it does seem, when you're in the thick of a CCS project, like an awful lot of effort. And, you know, like Peta said, it's not rocket science, that some of this stuff is very basic information sharing and education and just putting the effort in and the face time in with local people and with important stakeholders. But what we are beginning to see is that because the CCS community has largely been doing this for the last at least 4 or 5 years, there's been a real turnaround in terms of the amount of public engagement, the amount of communication that has been actively happening, that you're not seeing these massive outcries, because there is an improving level of understanding in the pockets in the areas where CCS projects are being muted or are being taking place. So I think there's a positive really that can be seen, maybe not large scale, like quantitative benefits, but there's certainly benefits from CCS developers, I think, that we can take as a sort of qualitative research to say that this is working, and that the effort and the investment in some of this communication and engagement work is paying dividends now.
And I think, Kirsty, just quickly on that, is that wherever a project, whether it is carbon capture or coal seam gas, what you're doing is challenging people's livelihoods. You're coming in and, you know, changing the way that people do things or trying to compete alongside their. So, and that can get to people's very deep set values about the way we do things around here. So it's really about taking the time to recognise that and to, you know, talk to them about their concerns. So it's really that thing about respect, I think.
Yeah. Okay, I've got a question about specifically some of the research, and they're asking, has there been work done on evaluating the effectiveness of socioeconomic benefits in increasing acceptance of CCS projects? I think this is covered in the report.
What do you mean, social and economic?
So the benefits of jobs and acts, it's about the framing thing. So has there actually been specific research done on framing the benefits of improvements to the economy, job opportunities?
There's been a few different ones, I think, along the way, and I mean, Kirsty, you're probably familiar with some of those as well. And I guess it depends around, we've often talked about that actually using jobs as a key benefit often is quite lame, because quite often it depends on the size of the community and where you're going, I suppose, as to what, because if it's, I remember we're talking in the Japanese context, if it's a large city that this is being added onto, the number of jobs that will give is actually quite small. So again, I think it does depend on the different projects and so forth, and then there's the different ways that you might frame the social and economic value of projects can be framed in so many different ways. Avoided cost, what does it bring? I think there's a range there. I'm probably not answering the question very well, but
no, I think as part of the site characterisation, they emphasise, asking the community about what are particular types of benefits from the project, and that would give you an opportunity to see what they see would be the benefits, usually compared most of the time to what a mining company can bring to a community, and it helps you set realistic expectations as well as the project of just going, actually, by the time the project's set up, there's only going to be 2 people here running and monitoring the well, so we're not looking to employ 300 people and all those types of things. So it's giving you the chance to ask the community, what are they expecting from this particular project, to then actually coming to the table and saying, well, this is what the project's about, and this is the actual benefits that we can bring to that community, and we can tick off some of your boxes, but not all of it. So it's setting that realistic expectation, which once again I think helps build with trust that you're not going to oversell what it is that you're going to deliver, and also to not address the expectations that you're not aware of.
Yeah, and I think there has definitely been, there was a period where there was lots of material coming out suggesting that we should really look at not focus so much on the climate change benefits of a technology like CCS, but look at the economic benefits that it can bring. And I think the point that both Anne-Maree and Peta have just made is really important, because it isn't always obvious what these economic benefits can bring specifically to a small local community, and that process of involving that community in trying to shape a project, not necessarily technically shape a project, but shape some of the work around the project to make it of more benefit to the community, is really important, and is an important process to go through with your stakeholders. We've got a question from Daniel Fernandez, who is actually a communication and outreach person on the Hontaman project in Spain, which I'll come on to in a second. But that Hontaman project is a good example of people working with the local community to improve education around about the resources and the land that they use in that area. And I think there's some really lovely examples on our website and also on the Sweden website about what they've done to try and improve community benefits and to work with their local stakeholders. So it's a good place to go for some of those, not necessarily financial socioeconomic benefits, but definitely social benefits for the community.
Kirsty, I remember one of my very first engagement with a community in sort of central Queensland around potential projects, and was talking about Kelly Tambamusi was talking about a potential pipeline and what that would mean. And I remember people responding going, pipeline, but that's going to mean more people coming here to build it. That means if we've got more people, it means we might get a doctor in the town full time. And so for regional Queensland, having access to a doctor, a GP, which is something we take for granted, take for granted in the city, was something that could really be a game changer for them. And I think similarly things around keeping projects local, so choosing local trades where you can, is another message that I think done quite a lot by large companies just to actually give another benefit, which is sort of extra, I guess.
And it's only going to become obvious if you've got that dialogue or that method to have a dialogue with your important stakeholders to understand those needs, I guess. Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm going to move on to Daniel's question. So he's first of all thanked you for the interesting webinar, and he's got a bit of a statement saying that he's looking for a bit more details on risk perception activities that are performed in some of the case studies that you've covered over the years, and he said that even a good baseline is fundamental, having a good baseline understanding, and also that how important is it that the staff who are in charge of explaining and communicating the subject have got good skills and empathetic skills. Again, another bit of a statement that he's saying there's always room for improvement on the communication of uncertainties and modelling, but with these sort of complex concepts and approaches, are there any other recommendations for engaging and communicating with a lay public?
So, I mean, straight up, I would recommend Daniel going to the work that Judith Bradbury led around communicating the risks. I think that's still up on the Global Institute. Yeah, I mean, I think the work that they did, actually systematically going through the risk literature and then looking at these different projects and how they worked with communities to explain the risks and see how much they understood them. I think probably you'll find most of the answers in that. It was very clear, and I think the sort of key projects, what they did was when they were actually making their own risk assessments of the different parts, they actually brought community members in to work with them. And so what you're doing there is probably building on all of those parts within the framework, because it actually helps to build, it builds trust, you're being open, you're being transparent, you've got a process that's engaging. So to me, it's actually really sort of putting that on the table and wherever you can. If that answers the question.
Peta, no, it's great. I think I've got two questions that I'm going to try and hit off before we call it a day, and we're getting quite close to time. This one was quite specific, and it was just if you could point this person in the direction of any research that you know exists with offshore projects and their perception, like offshore storage projects around perception and social research, and specifically with like the kind of stakeholders that you're dealing with in an offshore project where you're dealing with like fishermen and more industrial stakeholders. Do you know of any research that's focused on that?
Well, it's interesting because I've had that question once before this week too, so I wonder if it's the same. But I think, I was actually we did some work when I was at CSIRO early on around looking at the different, around is there a social licence to expand deep sea floor mining. So we actually did a bit of toe in the water work on that, and so those reports are published, and there is some articles, and also comparing how people perceive onshore and offshore mining. So it's not exactly the same as CCS, but the early work of Howard and Makoto's Ocean Storage Hawaii project, I mean, that's documented. That's quite an interesting one. That was just that very first time of actually, shall we try it? And then I was actually trying to follow up, Kirsty, the Japanese project where they did a lot of engagement with the fishers. That wasn't that, because I thought that was actually they did a lot of engagement with the locals, and I thought that I was going to try and find that one, because I think there's a really good article in that around how they went to deal with that. So they're the ones that I'm aware of.
Yeah. The Japanese one, I think the second phase is coming out fairly shortly.
Yeah, so because I think that, although again, it's a different culture depending on where the question came from, it does change, I think. So again, some of the more generic things would apply around that, but I think again it's sort of understanding, so what are the livelihoods of the people that you're interacting with, what are the trade-offs that are going on, and have those conversations, listening to the concerns, and then going forward, I think is what I would be doing.
Brilliant. Okay, so just to finish us off with a sort of closing question, and I guess it's a bit of a two-pointer. I was wondering if you could summarise where you see the general state of public engagement and communication efforts on CCS currently, and then to finish up, what do you think is the future that you would envision for social research and its implementation of its findings in CCS projects?
There's probably two key areas that we've seen is around the compensation area. So colleagues in the Netherlands are doing work, aren't they, around
that's been published.
The different Emma and Bart's work around compensation and how that plays a role around the engagement process. So that was one key area that we saw was a key gap, and that's starting to get filled. But once again, just reiterating that we think there's still that gap around actually knowing how to do the engagement process in developing countries. I think are the two key areas from my perspective that research really is needed in this area.
And I think we put in the report the idea around transportation. I know the guys at Tyndall have done a little bit of work on that, but I think, you know, the whole idea of pipelines and transporting of CO2, I mean, some projects are talking, you know, in the early days, transporting via trucks or anything with trucks actually has problems, you know, so there's those sorts of things with some of the ideas for future research. What was the other one, the start question? Sorry, old person, I've only remembered the second question.
To just summarise the general state of public engagement and communication efforts on CCS from your point of view, given the last 5+ years of work in this area.
So I think, well, and Kirsty, you can probably answer this even better than I and us, really, because you're sort of on the ground and linking. So my understanding is, you know, my answer would be it all depends on the country, where the projects are, you know, what stage of development the projects are, as to how much communication and engagement activity has gone on for CCS. You know, at the moment there's quite a strong focus, I think, looking in the UK and what the UK government's funding. I know projects here in Australia at different levels. I know Brendan and the guys in South Africa. So I think it does depend on where projects. I'm working with one of the Guangzhou project in China, working with them. So there is things moving along, and I guess that was my really final point around the more that these projects move forward, and we synthesise learnings and we can draw on, you know, what's happening, I think is where it's all going to go, I guess, really. So you need the projects, you need the actual hands-on stuff. So, you know, even Sally Greenberg at the Decatur project, what's going on there, the fact that they've stored this much CO2, that helps to say, well, look, this is happening. So you might want to add something, Kirsty.
You know, Anne-Maree, is there anything from you? Are you happy if I...
Yeah, no, that's fine, Kirsty. Yep.
Yeah, I think, Peta, you can tell from the amount of research, which I think is indicative of the work that has been going on in this space. You can really see a growth in the interest in public engagement and the seriousness with which it's been taken. I think the sort of litmus test for me is that when I first started working in public engagement and communication in CCS, the battle was actually about making project developers recognise that it was important to do this, full stop. Now there's much more nuanced conversations happening about the best methods of doing this, and learning from best practice, and the importance of having some of these large scale projects up and running and extracting learning from these projects. And I think that shift in conversation really represents the shift that there has been in the seriousness that this topic is taking within the CCS industry. So I'm fairly positive about it, but I think, as you pointed out, in a number of areas where this is still pretty new and it's not been part of a policy and an energy discussion, it's important that we get that the learning and a lot of this best practice to these areas which are just beginning to look at CCS, and definitely that area of capacity development in developing nations, I think is an interest for future, and it's an area that we're getting a lot more feedback, and a lot of interest is starting to arise from a number of countries. Okay, well guys, we've run slightly over time, so I think if everybody is happy, there were a couple more questions left, but I will do my best to get answers to those people directly. And just to reiterate that the webinar will be online fairly shortly for you to watch again. And I wanted to really just thank Peta and Anne-Maree for their time and input today, congratulate them for a very for the rigour and the evidence-based practices that they and the team of researchers that they work with globally have really helped to move these best practices into mainstream education and outreach work around CCS. And finally, the synthesis report that we've been talking about today is available on our website, and you can see the link on the slide there. We really recommend that you have a good read through that and look at the links to all the other reports that that this synthesis report covers. And then finally, the last thing to do is just thank our technical advisor Kylie, who's been operating the webinar behind the scenes to make sure that I don't press the wrong buttons, and also to thank you, the audience, for your attention and great discussion afterwards. There's been a huge amount of interest. So thanks everyone, and goodbye.